Jeffrey Dahmer didn't just take lives, he dismantled them, piece by piece, moment by moment. In a quiet apartment in Milwaukee, a soft-spoken, lonely man carried out some of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. And the most chilling part is this: there were warning signs long before the world started paying attention. Signs that were ignored. Signs that grew darker. Signs that turned a shy boy into a monster. Before we dive in, tell me one thing. What time is it where you're watching this? And are you watching alone? And if you find value in deep psychological breakdowns, make sure to subscribe to Criminology, hit the bell icon, and like this video so more people can discover the truth behind the darkest minds in history. Jeffrey Dahmer's story does not begin in a crime scene. It begins in a quiet Midwestern home with a boy who felt invisible long before he became infamous. His early childhood was not marked by obvious violence or uncontrollable rage. Instead, it was marked by something far more subtle: emotional absence. Dahmer grew up in a household filled with arguments, tension, and instability. His mother battled severe mental health issues, and his father, though present physically, was consumed by work and emotional distance. In that environment, Jeffrey learned his first and most damaging skill: how to disappear emotionally long before he ever disappeared morally. As a child, Dahmer didn't seek attention or connection the way most kids did. He drifted, detached, quiet. His loneliness didn't scream, it whispered. Teachers described him as polite but distant, a boy who existed in the background, unnoticed. And while loneliness doesn't create killers, it can create a vacuum, a psychological void waiting to be filled. For Dahmer, that void began filling with disturbing fascinations before anyone recognized the danger. His interest in animal bones started innocently enough, framed as childhood curiosity. But this curiosity began to evolve. He didn't just observe the bones. He studied them, cleaned them, collected them. He spoke of the sounds they made, the textures, the structure, as if bones were more interesting than living beings. This fixation wasn't just a hobby. It was a coping mechanism for a boy who felt powerless and disconnected. When kids grow up without emotional security, some retreat into fantasy. Dahmer did the same, but his fantasies were not of adventure or heroism. They were fantasies of control. Fantasies where the subject could not leave him, could not reject him, could not abandon him because the subject was no longer alive. Not yet murder, but the psychology of stillness, possession, and dominance was already forming. As Jeffrey entered adolescence, the isolation intensified. His parents' marriage deteriorated. The arguing grew louder. The emotional distance widened. And Dahmer, instead of seeking escape or support, withdrew further inside himself. Social connections were nearly none. He had no close friends, no romantic relationships, and no real guidance. In the mind of a lonely child, fantasies often become substitutes for social bonds. But for Dahmer, these fantasies were laced with darkness, obsession, and a desire that he could not act upon, at least not yet. Around this time, his fascination shifted from animal remains to human anatomy. He became obsessed with torsos, with the stillness of the human form, with the idea of possessing another person completely. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous: the merging of fantasy and desire. Dahmer didn't want companionship, he wanted control. He wanted presence without resistance, company without conversation, and affection without the vulnerability of human interaction. His fantasies were rooted in deep emotional starvation, but they mutated into something predatory, something obsessive. By the time he reached high school, Jeffrey Dahmer was living two lives. One was external, the quiet, odd, but harmless boy who kept to himself. The other was internal, a world filled with fantasies of domination, paralysis, and absolute possession. As he struggled to manage these fantasies, alcohol became his escape. Drinking numbed the loneliness, quieted the intrusive thoughts, and gave him the temporary illusion of control over his mind. Most teenagers drink to socialize or experiment. Dahmer drank to silence his darkness. His first violent fantasies emerged during these years. He imagined overpowering men. He imagined their helplessness. He imagined keeping them. This wasn't rooted in hatred or anger. It was rooted in fear, fear of abandonment and rejection, twisted into a pathological need for control. Psychologists often describe this as the point where loneliness turns malignant. where emotional detachment evolves into deviant fantasy, and where fantasy begins to blur with intention. The red flags were everywhere, but none were connected. His fascination with dead animals was dismissed. His alcoholism was ignored. His social isolation was overlooked. And when his parents divorced, Dahmer's emotional world collapsed completely, with no guidance, no stability, and no supervision. He became untethered, psychologically drifting toward the darkest corners of his mind. In the summer of 1978, shortly after graduating high school, Dahmer's fantasies finally collided with reality. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, a young man who simply wanted a ride. Dahmer didn't plan to kill him that day. It wasn't premeditated. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't even a moment of rage. Instead, it was a moment of complete emotional panic. Hicks wanted to leave, and Dahmer could not handle the idea of someone he desired walking away from him. It was abandonment all over again. The emotional wound of childhood reopened, but this time, he acted on the darkness he had been nurturing for years. In a sudden, desperate attempt to stop Hicks from leaving, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell. The act was impulsive, but the next steps were not. The cleanup, the dismemberment, the hiding of the body, those actions required calculation. And as chilling as it sounds, that process awakened something inside him. For Dahmer, this was the point of no return. He had crossed a psychological threshold, and instead of fear or remorse, he felt something else: satisfaction, control, and most dangerously of all, a desire to do it again. What makes Dahmer terrifying is not just the cruelty of his crimes, but the quiet transformation that led to them. He did not explode into violence like many impulsive murderers. He slipped into it, slowly, silently, over years of emotional neglect, isolation, and unaddressed psychological decay. His childhood did not excuse his actions, but it undeniably shaped his pathology. He became a monster not in an instant, but through a gradual erosion of empathy and a growing attachment to the fantasy world he created inside his mind. This is why understanding Dahmer's early years is essential. It reveals how dangerous loneliness can become when paired with fantasy, impulse, and deep emotional detachment. It shows how monsters are not created by a single event, but by the accumulation of many small failures, ignored warnings, and psychological wounds left untreated. Jeffrey Dahmer's first murder did not immediately turn him into a serial killer. In fact, after killing Stephen Hicks, years passed before he killed again. But those years were not peaceful. They were years of pressure building underneath the surface, like a silent volcano preparing to erupt. Dahmer tried to live a normal life. He tried to suppress the fantasies. He tried to blend in, but the fantasies refused to die. They followed him through his routines, through his loneliness, through every attempt he made to be normal. And each time he failed at controlling his mind, the darkness inside him grew stronger. The killing of Stephen Hicks created two things Dahmer had never felt before: a sense of ultimate control and a terrifying realization that he could carry out his darkest fantasies in the real world. He knew he had crossed a boundary that most human beings can't even approach. Yet instead of running from it, part of him welcomed it. The psychological high of control lingered, even as guilt and fear battled for dominance within him. And so, Dahmer fell into a strange emotional limbo. Part of him terrified of what he had done, and another part quietly craving the power that came with it. His life after that murder spiraled in multiple directions. His drinking worsened. His attempts to hold a job crumbled. His attempts at socializing remained awkward and short-lived. He bounced between living situations, constantly trying to keep the darkness at bay. But alcoholism became his primary coping mechanism. Alcohol dulled the intrusive fantasies, numbed his awareness, and temporarily silenced the voices demanding control. Dahmer wasn't drinking to party, he was drinking to survive himself. As the years passed, the fantasies grew more vivid. They no longer involved abstract scenarios or distant figures. They involved real people, faces he saw in public, men he wished he could keep close, men he wished would never leave him. Normal desire twisted into something predatory, something rooted not in passion but in possession. Psychologists call this a progression of paraphilic fantasy, the escalation from imagination to obsession, and from obsession to preparation. By the late 1980s, Dahmer's internal world had become unbearable. His fantasies weren't simply intrusive, they were overwhelming. He no longer wanted companionship. He wanted control. He wanted obedience. He wanted someone who would stay exactly where he placed them, without resistance, without fear, without independence. And so, in 1987, after almost a decade of psychological deterioration, Dahmer killed again, and this time, the progression into routine murder began. The second victim? Stephen Twomey marked the beginning of a new cycle. Dahmer brought Twomey to a hotel room, got him heavily intoxicated, and experienced another blackout. When he woke up and realized he had killed Twomey, he did not panic. He acted. It was the same pattern as before: dismemberment, disposal, and an eerie sense of satisfaction. But something inside him had changed. He no longer saw killing as a catastrophic mistake. He now saw it as a solution to his fantasies, a way to maintain control over another human being in a way that real relationships could never provide. And from this point on, Dahmer's descent accelerated. Killing became more frequent. The periods between murders shortened. The fantasy of companionship evolved into something colder and more disturbing. Dahmer didn't want company. He wanted a human puppet, someone who would stay with him forever, completely under his control. His victims were not merely people, they became objects in his psychological world. Props in a scenario he had been building for years. His methods became more calculated. He lured men to his apartment with promises of money or photos. Once inside, he drugged their drinks with sleeping pills, ensuring they would not resist. Control was everything to him. Complete stillness, complete surrender, complete obedience. It wasn't the killing itself that he craved most. It was the power to paralyze someone, to keep them with him, to make them his possession. This obsession led to one of the most disturbing elements of Dahmer's psychology: the desire to create zombies. Dahmer experimented with drilling holes into his victims' skulls and injecting acid or boiling water directly into their brains. His goal was horrifying. He wanted to erase their will while keeping their bodies alive. For Dahmer, total control meant more than murder. It meant transforming a living human being into an object that could not leave him. These attempts were not born of madness, but of calculation. Dahmer was not delusional. He knew exactly what he was doing. He understood the consequences. He understood the cruelty. But the psychological void inside him, the emptiness from childhood, had grown into a monstrous force, and that void demanded control at any cost. As his murders continued, Dahmer developed rituals. He kept skulls. He photographed his victims at every stage. He arranged their bodies, posed them, preserved them. These rituals served a psychological purpose. They helped him feel connected, but without the vulnerability of real intimacy. They allowed him to relive his crimes in moments of loneliness. They allowed him to feel powerful when his internal world felt empty. Cannibalism emerged at this stage, not out of hunger, but out of what he described as a need to feel a permanent connection to his victims. To him, consuming them meant they became a part of him forever. It was the darkest expression of his desire to keep people close, to keep them from leaving. This act alone highlights the twisted intersection between love, possession, and domination that defined Dahmer's thinking. The most chilling aspect of this chapter in Dahmer's life is how normal he appeared to those around him. Neighbors joked with him. People saw him as quiet, awkward, and harmless. He went to work. He shopped. He smiled politely. This duality, predator on the inside, harmless man on the outside, is one of the defining traits of a certain class of killers. They camouflage their darkness with MUNDA, NITY. Yet, as the murders escalated, so did Dahmer's recklessness. His apartment became a prison of decay, smells, chemicals, tools, body parts, photography equipment. He was losing control of himself, even as he attempted to control others. Alcohol consumption skyrocketed. He took greater risks. He ignored neighbors' concerns. His internal system of secrecy began to crack. This downward spiral was not only predictable, it was inevitable. Psychologists describe this phase as the compulsive collapse, where the killer's rituals, fantasies, and impulses reach maximum intensity and the external world begins to crumble under the weight of their actions. Dahmer was no longer functioning. He was obeying impulses that had taken full control of his mind. And yet, even in this chaos, Dahmer wasn't ready to stop. His fantasies had fully fused with his reality. His desires no longer frightened him, they guided him. His need for control had become more powerful than his fear of being caught. And that psychological surrender is what pushed him toward the final chapter of his terrifying journey. By the summer of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's world was collapsing under the weight of his own compulsions. His apartment had turned into a shrine of death, a place where fantasy, violence, and decay fused into a single environment that reflected the darkest corners of his psyche. The air was thick with chemicals, the freezer filled with human remains, and the walls lined with photographs documenting every stage of his crimes. Dahmer lived inside a self-made tomb, a prison of his own impulses. And yet, he continued to bring victims home, driven by the compulsive need for control that had taken absolute command of his mind. But the truth about killers like Dahmer is simple. Sooner or later, they collapse under the complexity of their own fantasies. The more rituals they create, the more mistakes they make. The more risks they take, the less capable they are of maintaining the mask that keeps them hidden. Dahmer wasn't caught because of brilliant police work. He was caught because he wanted too much control too quickly, and his internal world finally erupted into the real one. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer invited another man to his apartment, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, but unlike the 17 victims before him, Edwards survived. Inside that small apartment, Tracy noticed the strange smell, the thick chemical odor, and the unusual amount of locks and restraints. Dahmer tried to handcuff him, threatened him with a knife, and attempted to force compliance. But Dahmer made a rare mistake. He didn't drug Edwards first. For the first time in years, Dahmer attempted control through fear alone. And fear was far less reliable than sedation. Edwards waited for the right moment and escaped. He flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers and led them straight to Dahmer's apartment. What happened next became one of the most chilling discoveries in criminal history. Inside that small, dimly lit apartment, officers found a nightmare severed heads in the refrigerator, skulls painted and preserved, jars containing organs, photographs documenting the process of dismemberment, and a 57-gallon drum filled with decomposing remains. Dahmer did not fight. He did not deny. He did not run. When confronted, he simply said, "For what I've done, I should be dead." From the moment he was arrested, Dahmer was unusually cooperative. He confessed everything, every murder, every method, every ritual in chilling detail. He seemed relieved, almost calm, as though being caught had finally released him from a storm he could no longer control. Psychologists later explained this reaction as dissociative relief, a phenomenon where a serial offender consumed by compulsion finds strange comfort when the responsibility of hiding is suddenly removed. During his interviews, Dahmer described his fantasies with an emotionless clarity. He spoke of control, of possession, of wanting people to stay. He admitted that his crimes were not fueled by hatred or anger, but by a consuming loneliness and the belief that murdering someone was the only way to prevent them from leaving him. He said he wanted total dominance over a person, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. In his mind, obedience equaled affection. Stillness equaled loyalty. It was one of the most disturbing psychological distortions ever documented. What made Dahmer even more chilling was his self-awareness. He did not blame demons, voices, or delusions. He did not claim insanity. He acknowledged that he understood right from wrong. He simply couldn't stop. This level of insight placed Dahmer in a rare and terrifying category, a predator fully conscious of his actions, but emotionally detached from their consequences. He knew his behaviors were monstrous, but he also admitted that the fantasy of control was stronger than any moral barrier. The trial that followed became a psychological battlefield. The prosecution argued that Dahmer was a cold, rational killer who planned his crimes with meticulous detail, proving he was legally sane. The defense argued that his extreme fantasies, necrophilic rituals, and cannibalism indicated severe mental illness. Ultimately, the jury determined that while Dahmer suffered from profound psychological disturbances, he still met the legal criteria for sanity. He knew what he was doing. He understood it was wrong. He simply chose to do it anyway. Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, totaling over 900 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. In prison, Dahmer displayed a bizarre calmness. He was polite, cooperative, and even made dark jokes about his crimes. He spent his days reading, exercising, and working in the prison chapel. Some officers said he seemed relieved to be in an environment where he couldn't hurt anyone. Others believed he remained dangerous until the end. But beneath Dahmer's calm exterior was a man whose psychological world had been shaped by layers of trauma, isolation, suppressed desires, and unchecked fantasies. His crimes were not spontaneous. They were the culmination of years of emotional detachment, social failure, and escalating obsession. Dahmer wasn't a monster born. He was a monster shaped over time by forces both internal and external. And his collapse was the inevitable end of a mind consumed by compulsion. In November 1994, Dahmer was attacked by another inmate, Christopher Scarver, who beat him to death inside the prison gym. Scarver later stated that he believed Dahmer had mocked other inmates by shaping food into limbs or leaving jokes about cannibalism. Others claimed Scarver was influenced by religious motives. Regardless of the reason, Dahmer's life ended violently the same way he had lived it. But the question that still haunts criminologists, psychologists, and the public is simple. Why did Jeffrey Dahmer become what he became? The answer, horrifyingly, is a combination of many factors: early trauma, emotional neglect, social isolation, a lack of healthy relationships, fantasies that grew uncontrollable, a desperate craving to possess people he felt he could never keep, and a psychological collapse that fused desire with violence. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a supernatural monster. He was a deeply damaged man whose internal world spiraled so far away from reality that he began sculpting his fantasies into human lives. His crimes remind us that true evil isn't always loud, aggressive, or obvious. Sometimes it lives quietly behind a polite smile, inside an ordinary apartment, in a man who blends into everyday life. While hiding a darkness most people cannot comprehend, Dahmer's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human psychology. It reveals how fantasies can escalate when left unchecked, how loneliness can distort desire, how emotional detachment can mutate into predatory fixation, and how a single person, shaped by years of silence and shadows, can become capable of horrors that defy imagination. As we close this chapter, remember, understanding the psychology of someone like Jeffrey Dahmer is not about glorifying him. It is about learning what warning signs were missed, what patterns went unrecognized, and what can be done to prevent the next person from walking the same terrifying path. Because monsters like Dahmer aren't born fully formed. They are created through a long, quiet descent that often remains unnoticed until it is far too late.